I'd like to welcome our radio audience, City Club members and their guests to the regular Friday program of the City Club of Portland. I'm Mary Kramer, president of the club. Our first order of business is to welcome new members. We have one new member today, Carla Escudero, account executive, Sisters of Providence Health Plans in Oregon. Carla, are you here? Let's give her a welcome. Couple of announcements today. On Friday, July 27th, our topic is Global Warming, Is the Prediction Sound? Reed Bryson, Senior Scientist, Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, is our speaker. We'll be here at the Benson Hotel in the Mayfair Room. I want to bring your attention to the bulletin this week. We did publish the full radio and cable television broadcast schedule for our Friday programs. If you miss being here, you can catch it on public radio, or you can catch it on some of our cable television providers. TCI, Paragon, Columbia, and WFTV all carry our programs. Our board host today, seated at the head table, is Jim Westwood, president-elect of the club and an attorney with Miller, Nash, Weiner, Hager, and Carlson. He has the privilege of asking the first question. The second question today will be asked by Tom Stanwood, chair of the Law and Public Safety Standing Committee and director of annual giving at Lewis and Clark College. After the program, we open to City Club members' questions. We give preference to those people who come to the mic, but there are forms available for written questions. They're on the table. Fill them out and hold them up after the program, and staff will collect them. Whether you ask a written or an oral question, we'd like for you to remember to be clear and concise. And remember, it's a question, not a statement. Now for today's program. Chamber Music Northwest is well known in our area, but it's rewarding to be told by a New York agent that Chamber Music Northwest is the most famous festival in America, and it's considered to be a plum to be asked to play here. Not willing to rest on those kind words, I asked for more. She said several things like, they have first-rate artists, it's well run, it's well attended, and it always presents a wide-ranging repertoire. So most musicians think it's really fun to come to Portland and be treated so well. And then she added, Chamber Music Northwest really put Portland on the map, musically speaking. Some people may disagree with her, but overall I thoroughly enjoyed hearing what she had to say. One of the shapers of that wonderful reputation is with us today, David Shifrin. He's their music director. He's been with the festival for 13 years, at first as a clarinetist and then as music director for the last 10 years. In my experience, reputation builders have fascinating backgrounds, and Mr. Shtfrin is no exception. He graduated from not one, but two prestigious music institutions, the Interlochen Arts Academy and the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. He's also been an orchestral musician with two prestigious organizations, the Cleveland Orchestra with Lauren Mazel and the American Symphony with Leopold Stokowski. And he's been a soloist who has appeared with the Philadelphia Orchestra and the symphony orchestras of Dallas, Houston, and Denver, just to name a few. He's been well recognized by his peers. He recently became an artist member of the Chamber Music Society of the Lincoln Center. He was awarded the Avery Fisher Career Grant, and he won a 1990 Grammy nomination for his recording of the Copland Clarinet Concerto with the New York Chamber Symphony. And then he has one other position. He's a professor of clarinet and chamber music at the Yale University School of Music. Please join me in welcoming a fascinating shaper of reputations, our speaker, David Shifrin.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I would love to know who the New York agent was who said that we were whatever we were, the finest music festival in the country. I finally found somebody I could truly agree with. I was asked to speak to this wonderful group of, if not reputation shapers, certainly shapers of the life and the pulse of this city of Portland. I was asked to talk to this group about why chamber music has become so popular in the last 20 years and so forth, and perhaps why it works so well during our festival here in Portland. But the first thing that came to my mind when trying to think of an approach to this is that chamber music has really been around for a long time, and we hear about the chamber music boom of the 70s and 80s, and I think that chamber music was probably the very first music that was ever heard, because when I think about where music came from, I like to think about prehistoric age and how sounds were made for necessary communication, and there must have been some moment, which of course hasn't been recorded, but some moment where these communications took the form of something more abstract than just the essential message of help me, there's a tiger chasing me, or ouch, I dropped a rock on my foot, and people might have started to enjoy the sounds they were hearing and then begun to make them just for that purpose alone. And I'm sure that there were not hundreds of people in this spontaneous event, but probably just a handful. So that's why I think the first music was probably chamber music. Of course, over the years and the centuries, chamber music has been written for countless types of occasions, sometimes spontaneously improvised, even by some of the great composers. We think of improvisation as a jazz form, but there were contests among colleagues 200 years ago, like Beethoven and Hummel would get together and try to outdo each other with their piano improvisations. And that was a type of a chamber music occasion, and then chamber music would be written for every week for a Sunday service by Bach. He'd write a cantata, or Mozart would write a wind serenade for a special court function, the royal palace. These occasions were so varied, and the musicians available for these occasions so diverse in their abilities and the instruments that they played, so that over the centuries a body of repertoire has accumulated that is so colorful and so wide-ranging that we could put on concerts not just for 5 weeks in Portland, but all year round if it was so requested, that we could have different instrumental combinations and different repertoire all the time. And in point of fact, what we try to do is to have that kind of diversity coupled with a cycle of what has been deemed over the centuries to be the plums, the really choice masterpieces by the great composers. In the past centuries, before radio and television and movies, and even in the past decades before computers and Nintendo games and compact discs and VCRs, when people were more apt to open a book or gather together and talk with one another, chamber music was a central part of social gatherings, family life, and an evening's entertainment. And I think in this day and age where it's almost staggering and amazing the rate at which technology is overtaking us, a lot of people seem to be forming the attitude of almost a counter-revolution, to have more of a hands-on experience with lots of things. Some people might want to work in their garden more, or have a vegetable garden instead of just going to the store and buying a head of lettuce in a package of shrink wrap, or just the idea, I know for me, of balancing my own checkbook without the use of a calculator sometimes to get me back to the feeling of doing something unaided by a microchip. Well, I think that somehow this mentality has helped in the last decade or two to get people more interested in hearing live performance, theater and orchestras, and most certainly chamber music, where it's an experience of the greatest intimacy where the players, each having their own individual part, are responsible for recreating a great work of art each time they play it, and that the audience, in usually rooms not much larger than this, or I should say hopefully rooms not much larger than this, can have a much greater sense of immediacy and intimacy with the musical performance than in, say, other forms, rock concerts in a stadium, grand opera, symphony orchestra. That is actually one of the great appeals, I think, for musicians as well as audience in chamber music, the immediacy of the event. Chamber music is also extremely portable, extremely flexible, and has a wide array of colors and expressive capabilities. Composers, almost every composer has had tried their hand at writing chamber music at one point or another. You can think of certain exceptions, like Wagner, who only wanted to make the grand statement, but even he gave the gift of the Siegfried Idyll to his son, a work for an intimate work, more intimate work than certainly than the Ring Cycle, for 11 or 13 instruments, whatever it is. Even Bruckner, who wrote his great big symphonies, tried his hand at a string quintet or sextet, and Strauss, whose operas and tone poems we're familiar with, wrote a violin sonata and a piano quartet. Then some of the great masters, such as Brahms and Mozart, wrote more chamber music than almost anything else. So we do have a tremendous body of repertoire to draw on, and we have the feeling of the event. So I don't think it needs a whole lot of rationalization on an artistic or a human basis to explain why chamber music is popular. I think another reason that in many communities, and perhaps in Portland more than many, the economics of chamber music in relation to the excellence or the quest for excellence of the event make a tremendous amount of sense. I think one of the things that I've read about Portland and experienced firsthand in the 13 summers that I've spent time here is the scale of the city compared to other cities that I've spent a lot of time in. The fact that the length of a city block is shorter, and the intimacy that seems to exist in the city, and the courteous nature with which we're treated in shops and restaurants and stores, that there seems to be a great sense of community in which a chamber music type event seems to be very appropriate. So the economic relation of that as well, that we put on an event which is relative to the size perhaps of the city. We don't have a metropolitan area of approaching 20 million here like we do in New York or in Los Angeles. And with the percentage of actual classical music concert goers being fixed in the single digits, it makes a certain amount of sense to put on an event geared at excellence on a small scale rather than trying to have a festival of, well, I shouldn't say this, but because Seattle is not even twice as big when they put on the Ring Cycle every summer. But I think it makes sense for what we do to have a festival, a really intense festival of 25 concerts each summer, where each audience ranges from 500 or 550 people. Over the years, Linda McGee, our executive director and resident statistician, has informed me that we've reached something upwards of 160,000 audience members, so that it indicates to me that Chamber Music Northwest has been accepted and is certainly here to stay. That's my fervent hope. The chamber music boom probably reflects these attitudes in other communities as well, and there have been very significant events in the musical world which I think have also contributed to that. I think there are two in particular that are of note. One is the founding in 1950 of the Marlborough Festival by Rudolf Serkin. It began as just a retreat for Mr. Serkin and several of his friends to go up to a secluded college campus in Marlborough, Vermont, and play music that they could enjoy amongst themselves. Well, the word eventually got out that they were doing that, and they said, well, why not just invite a few friends or a few interested parties to hear what we've been doing? And then that led to a concert series, and the media got a hold of the information, and people were flocking to Marlborough to hear this wonderful musical event. It became more of a school for a while, with the old masters like Sirkin and Casals and a number of notable musicians, Marcel Moïse, the famous French flutist, being the older generation of masters and bringing some of the younger conservatory graduates and young professionals to work with the old masters and learn the repertoire and have basically the legacy handed down to them. Many of the musicians who spent a number of summers at Marlborough have sort of graduated from that school and are now spending their summers in Portland, Oregon, I'm happy to say. Another very significant event in the furtherance of chamber music was the founding of Lincoln Center, and the charter, the mandate as part of Lincoln Center, in addition to the two opera companies and the ballet company and the symphony orchestra and the library and the theater, was to have a resident repertory ensemble of chamber music, and that was the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. And I think that event and the tours from the Chamber Music Society and the tours from Marlborough have helped kind of foster the idea that we can have a resident repertory group of musicians playing a diverse repertoire of chamber music. In any case, we're going to illustrate that a little bit later today with just two works. A standard, I shouldn't say standard because probably not that many people on a weekly or daily basis hear Mozart's Piano Trio in G major, but it's a great late work by the great master. And a lesser known work by a lesser known composer. Also we'll hear the quintet for flute and strings of Kuhlau. I'll introduce those works later. But before we do that, I would like to say that because of the nature of chamber music and the fact that each player has their own part and has a great responsibility as well as the chance to enjoy themselves in music making, chamber music has become something that is really enjoyed by the musicians, and I believe that that is another factor which makes it appealing to the audience. You can feel the joy and the commitment of the musicians who are making the music, and that is something that contributed to the great success of the Marlborough Festival, and I believe that that's something that contributes to the success of Chamber Music Northwest. Musicians that we have been fortunate enough to have join us here at Chamber Music Northwest represent some of the most well-known and well-respected organizations in the country and in the world for that matter. Over the years, we've had members of groups such as the Beaux-Arts Trio and the Golub Kaplan Card Trio, who, as a matter of fact, is here in their entirety today, because I saw Mr. Golub walk in a few minutes ago. We've had members of the Guarneri and the Juilliard String Quartets, the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, Tashi. We also have an unusually high concentration, and I think this is coincidental, concentration of music directors of other organizations who come to Portland to play with their colleagues. We have Ikon Bey, who is the music director of the Barge Music series in New York City, Fred Sherry, who is the artistic director of the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, and Charles Wadsworth has appeared here, who was Fred's successor there. Ida Kavafi and is the music director of her own Chamber Music Festival in Vail, Colorado, and in Angel Fire, New Mexico. We've had principal players from orchestras like the New York and Los Angeles Philharmonics, and you could safely say that one or another of our musicians at Chamber Music Northwest has performed at virtually every major festival and with every major orchestra of the world, and I think that it speaks very well of Portland that we're able to attract musicians to come to this community to play music when they're being invited to play almost anywhere in the world that they would like to at one time or another. And particularly in the summer, because of this chamber music, or so-called chamber music boom in the last 20 years, one offshoot has been that many, many communities have established festivals such as Chamber Music Northwest. And there are a wide array of choices that a top musician can make as to where they're going to ply their trade. And I think that it speaks very well for Portland that so many top-grade musicians are willing to come here for the first time and come back summer after summer. I think that it's because of a number of factors, but the primary one is that we have built a kind of a relationship and trust with our audience, and there's nothing to compare for a musician with the feeling that when you're playing a concert that people are really listening and are in some way appreciating what you're doing. So you, as the leaders of your community, are to be commended and thanked for being involved in developing such a community which is so receptive to us. So we thank you for allowing us to share this community and to share our music with you each summer. I know that there are some questions, and I could go on all afternoon, and I realize we have some music prepared, and that there are definitely going to be some questions. So I haven't looked at my watch or gotten a cue, but it just feels like about the time to open that up.
Good timing, David. Sure. Our first question will be from Jim Westwood, President-elect.
Mr. Shifrin, as we were sitting here at lunch, you mentioned that the Chamber of Music Northwest receives a substantial portion of its funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, and obviously that's a matter of some controversy these days, the endowment, not Chamber of Music Northwest. But I wonder, in view of the fact that some organizations are turning back their funding now on aesthetic and political, I guess, bases, is Chamber of Music Northwest planning to do anything similar? If so, why? And if not, why not?
Would you repeat the last part of the question again?
Is Chamber Music Northwest, does it have any plans to make any formal protest in the form of refusing funding from the National Endowment?
Not to my knowledge. I know that that has been done recently by the, was it the Oregon Shakespeare Festival? And I'm sure they have their reasons. My conviction is not necessarily contrary to that, but I believe that the National Endowment is made up of many components: the director, the constituent politicians, and each grant that, to my knowledge, is given is passed upon by individual panels. And each of these people is chosen for their expertise in the individual field that they are being asked to judge on. Somehow, to me, to refuse a grant that has been appropriated for an organization which is already struggling for existence is a little too much like the proverbial cutting off your nose to spite your face. I think that there are other ways to protest your disagreement with policy and in Washington than to refuse help for organizations which desperately need them. That's my opinion. I respect what they did in Ashland. I have, if I might take the opportunity to talk about the endowment a little bit. I know it's the hot item of note right now, and this organization would be in dire straits, the Chamber of Music Northwest, if it weren't for the National Endowment for the Arts. And you know, we might joke backstage about streaking the concert or something like that, which actually was something that used to happen in the 60s, and thereby voiding our eligibility for an endowment grant. But you know, 99.9999% of art that is funded by the National Endowment is so worthy and so without any detractions for the public that it astounds me that there's even a movement to question the validity of the endowment. In any case, what I was starting to say earlier is that the way that it's set up is that the endowment, which is essentially a political organization in Washington, D.C., delegates the responsibility for choosing grant to experts in each field in the arts, and then to give a grant and then have it taken away is taking the trust away from the people who have been delegated, and delegated by the politicians. So I would, rather than discontinuing or somehow compromising the National Endowment, I would advise those people in Washington to try to choose more carefully the people who are making their important decisions.
Tom Stanwood, Chair of the Law and Public Safety Standing Committee.
Believe me, despite the title, I'm a great lover of classical music, and this is why I wanted to ask this question. It's something that's really been concerning me, Mr. Shifrin. Up until a few years ago, Portland had 2 full-time commercial classical music stations serving the metropolitan area. And as we now know, there are none. My question, excuse me, to you is, how can Chamber Music Northwest, the Symphony, and other musical organizations here in Portland act as a catalyst for the return of a commercial classical radio station to the Portland area?
Well, I'm sure you have a valid concern, and I remember those commercial stations, but I don't think that the average classical music lover, when they switch the dial from I forget the call letters. It used to be KOAP, KBPS, and the two public radio stations now which play classical music. I know I personally am not always that aware about whether I'm listening to a public radio station or a commercial radio station, and it raises the point as to whether, the fundamental point as to whether the arts, classical music or classical music on the airwaves, should be a commercial enterprise or an enterprise which is funded by the government. And personally, I'm delighted to flick the radio dial and hear classical music that isn't interrupted with ads for used cars and grocery stores and things like that, but rather interspersed with announcements for live concerts and the occasional fundraiser. If this indicates to some people that it wouldn't exist without the help of the government, I would beg to disagree. I think that without the public radio stations, we would then have commercial classical music radio stations. My preference is to have the public radio stations. I'm sure people would disagree with that, but that's how I feel about it.
Mr. Shifrin, we have enjoyed chamber music. We attended Cattle and Gable and have for some years. These people that you bring out here are obviously very interesting personalities, and I wonder if Portland, those of us that might be interested in doing so, would have any opportunity to return something to them if any of them have time to do sightseeing, whether there would be an opportunity to make a connection and offer that opportunity. Or do you keep these artists so busy that they don't have time to look around?
Well, I get some feedback from some of the musicians about how they don't even have time to go to the big tourist attractions and so forth. And I try to mitigate that schedule. To first thank you for your very kind and generous sentiments, and tell you that over the years, many of our musicians have formed lasting friendships with many of the people in the community, people who come to the concerts and people who they've met, and are very grateful for that. And it's in many ways an incentive to come back each summer and make music. Yes, we keep the musicians busy. If somehow we could get a larger budget and bigger contributions and more help from the media to sell out all of our concerts, maybe we'd have more money and would be able to hire more musicians so they wouldn't have to work so hard playing every night and could have a better time. I mean, all of these things are evolutionary. We are now at the point where we're playing so many concerts that we've had to bring in more musicians to play them. And we're still searching for just the right balance between leisure time and work time, as is most of the people in the country. But thank you for the kind invitation, and I think the musicians who play Chamber Music Northwest are just like everybody else. Some are more social than others. Some relish their private time. Some are always looking for a party to go to. And you have to speak with our people in our office who coordinate our time each summer to find out, how we can all get together.
What would be the contact to make such an offer?
Well, if I might be so bold as to offer our executive director's name, Linda McGee. She keeps us all in line.
Thank you.
Shannon Stewart, City Club member. While we all appreciate greatly the atmosphere at Reed College campus, it seemed last night that many people in the audience were suffering greatly from the heat. Has there been any consideration given to either moving the concert into an air-conditioned building or perhaps having outdoor concerts on the campus at Reed?
Well, there's been consideration given to all of that ever since the concerts have been given at Reed. And one of the developments from that consideration is the Tuesday and Friday repeat series at Catlin Gable, which is allegedly air-conditioned. And it's, well, I'm always lobbying for them to crank it up higher or for a lower temperature at Catlin, but it is air-conditioned, and on those 90-degree days, it's much more livable to hear a concert at Catlin Gable. It's really a contrast. It's interesting sometimes for an audience member to hear the same program in both places because it is somewhat of a different experience acoustically, and certainly the ambiance of Reed College Commons versus the auditorium at I think the Cable Center at Catlin Gable. The question has been raised so many times, and we have been in so many negotiations with Reed College about joint funding of air conditioning, and we actually have done many things to try to make it better and are still talking about reflective materials on the skylights so that the sunlight won't heat the building up so much. And now we have a sprinkler system on the roof to cool it down a little bit and more ventilation than we used to have. And I think that I can tell a difference, I think. It's one of those things. Last night, just for the heck of it, I brought a little miniature thermometer out on stage. And it was next to my chair, and it was 85 degrees on the floor. I don't know what the temperature was at face level. So if it's uncomfortable in the audience, just imagine what it's like under the lights. I agree with you 100%. We wish we could get some air conditioning. We've looked at so many other places and thought about the possibility of moving the festival, but those few really hot nights notwithstanding, I still think that the combination of just intimacy and acoustics and the ambiance at Reed College still makes for about the best setting that we've been able to find here in Portland.
Marcia Slappy, member. Mary said something about this, and so have you, so maybe this is a ridiculous question, but do you have any trouble at all having musicians come to Portland?
I'm glad you asked that question, because one of the greatest resources of the festival here is the goodwill of my colleagues, the musicians. And sometimes there are musicians who are willing to overlook certain things. For years, we all lived in dormitories, and as the festival grew and the level of playing matured, so did the average age of the musicians, and their willingness to share 20 people to one kitchen and use communal bathroom facilities and so forth. And we have had tremendous cooperation from the board of directors in recent years towards finding more civilized housing arrangements and towards raising the money that's necessary to provide rental cars and just the basic living amenities that many of our musicians have been privileged to become accustomed to. The biggest problem, of course, always has been and probably always will be money. If we could pay higher fees then musicians could stay at the Heathman and, and drive Cadillacs. But we are in a competition for talent with many other organizations in the summer, and it's a very serious one. I have invited a number of musicians who have turned me down, a number of musicians who have come 1 or 2 summers and been able to command higher fees elsewhere, or just feel that for whatever reason that this wasn't for them. I'm very happy that the vast majority of the musicians that we've tried to have come and play here have enjoyed it enough that they'll come back for at least a limited period of time for several summers. I just would like to, in final response to that question, say that the support of the community financially and with other resources like cars and houses and apartments that could be sublet in the summertime are extremely important, and it is an ongoing concern that we have.
Just so the talent knows, we do appreciate them.
Thank you. I'm sure they appreciate hearing that.
Richard Darnell, a City Club member. What happened at Chamber Music Society in Lincoln Center that prompted the upheaval in the organization? What was it, 2 years ago?
Well, Charles Wadsworth, who had been the only music director of the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, retired. And the board chose Fred Sherry to replace him. Fred Sherry accepted the job with the understanding that it would be his group. So he formed a new group. That's what happened.
Why don't we move into the
Okay.
musical part?
We are now going to move into the musical part, my favorite part. We've chosen 2 selections from our final concerts for Chamber Music Northwest. The Mozart Trio in G major will be performed in, at least 2 of the movements from the trio will be performed by a group which has been together as a constant now for about 8 or 9 years. David Golub, Mark Kaplan, and Colin Carr play together as a trio year-round and tour the world when they're not playing solo dates on their own. And they've also been at the festival for varying numbers of years. David Golub even outnumbers me in the number of summers that he's spent here, being 14. I think Mark has been here for 6 summers, and Colin is the newcomer with only 2. And each of them has an extremely distinguished career as a soloist, and it was very exciting when they came together as a trio and started touring and making recordings. And we will hear the third movement. I see just the third movement. I'll let the musicians announce the selection. Golub, Kaplan, Carr here.
David said we're going to play at least 2 movements, but I think the word is that in order to have time for the clarinet quintet as well, we're just going to play you 1 movement, but we chose the best for you. This is the last movement of Mozart's Trio in G major, Kerschel 564.
We do have to shift a little bit, so during the interim, we're going to have the drawing for the 2 tickets. David, would you like to do the honors for the drawing? You want to call out the numbers?
797813.
You want to read it again?
797813.
There we
Oh,
go.
there we go.
Have a winner.
Good. Well, I hope you're free on Saturday night to come to our concert. Good. Congratulations. You know, I apologize for having talked so long as to cut into the time that you could hear music. But I must say that the venue at Reed College and at Catlin Gable is far superior for music than this, which is wonderful for speaking and for having lunch. And I would also like to thank my musicians for being so patient. The next piece that you hear will be selections from the Kuhlau, Friedrich Kuhlau, I believe, quintet for flute, not clarinet, 1 violin, 2 violas, and cello. Kuhlau was roughly contemporary with Beethoven. He was born just a few years after Mozart died, I believe, and was especially fond of the flute. He wrote 3 of these quintets, and I'll let Ransom Wilson introduce the piece. Ransom Wilson, the flutist, has been coming here for about 8 summers, I believe, and performs worldwide, has performed as soloist here with the Oregon Symphony, and is the music director of his own orchestra, the Solisti New York, and pursues a conducting career as well as a flute career. Equan Bay is the music director of Barge Music and a wonderful violinist, but will be playing viola today. Paul Neubauer, former principal violist of the New York Philharmonic, is now with the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center and enjoys an active solo career. You'll hear Mark Kaplan and Colin Carr again, in addition to their solo careers. They are esteemed members of the Golub Kaplan Carr trio. Thank you, fellows.
Yes, this is a flute. The clarinet is the black one.
I learn something new every day.
We are going to play the last movement of Kuhlau's, Friedrich Kuhlau's quintet in A major for flute and strings. Kuhlau was German, but he went to Denmark and made his career in Copenhagen and became Denmark's most celebrated composer in the 19th century. And he wrote sort of their national song, which is from incidental music to a play called Elverhøj. And everybody on the street in Copenhagen can sing Kuhlau's music for you.
Let's give people one more chance to ask a question if we have another question in the audience. Here we go. Ned?
Mr. Shifrin, was, as you described, the burgeoning popularity of chamber music throughout the country. Do you see any problem, or might you comment on the development of artists that are capable of presenting this in the style and to the degree that you'd like to see it done?
Well, I think that there happens to be an abundance of talent. Judging from my own experience as a teacher, having taught at Yale and at Juilliard and at other universities, music departments, I think that the number of talented young people still outnumbers the performing opportunities for them. Of course, there is always room at the top for the finest performers, and for those organizations which are looking for performance at the highest level, it's always difficult to entice those players to perform. But there are very large numbers of musicians being trained in many conservatories and universities throughout the country. If that answers your question satisfactorily, I hope.
Helen Corbett, a member. Is it you who makes the decision for which of, for instance, your stable of pianists or violinists is to play in a particular piece? And isn't that hard?
That is the essence of my position, and yes, it's hard. The basic duties that I have are to select the music and decide who is to be invited to play at the festival, and once they're here, what they're going to play. And there's a lot of negotiating going on, I can assure you. One thing that's very important to remember for me in doing that and when communicating with my colleagues, and that might be interesting to you, is that most musicians make their plans at least a year or two ahead of time. And so we're in discussions a lot of the time about pieces that we might like to do in a season or two. And I guess the point is that my colleagues and I hopefully have established enough of a trust that if somebody like Iquan Bey, for instance, is stuck on one concert playing only second viola in the flute quintet, as is the case with this program, he knows that if he comes back next year, he'll get something nice to do.
Thank you, musicians of Chamber Music Northwest and David Shifrin, for a wonderful program.
Thanks for having me here, and once again I'd like to thank the musicians who performed and hope that most of you will have a chance to hear them in the concert hall setting that they deserve. Thank you.
We are adjourned.